Hey everybody! It's been quite a while. Been very busy moving, but I saw the new Copernicus additions to Houdini, and I had to get my hands into that and experiment a little bit. So I wanted to make just a quick show and tell of something I made using the new Copernicus context or network within Houdini. This was inspired by uh, a rock wall. I just moved into a new house. It was inspired by the wall behind my home. I wanted to try to just recreate something like that using COPs, or Copernicus as it's called now. And really had a great time doing it, heavily inspired by Nine Between's Houdini tutorials with just a little variations, which I will talk to you all about. And I'll link to that original tutorial in the comments. So these are just a few pictures of the results. It's all based off a line. You can change it into any shape. The rock textures on the actual side of the wall are based upon a Copernicus network, and then this flat sort of slate-like rocks on top are generated all in SOPs with a procedural material. So I'm not going to go step by step over exactly how to build this, but I'm just going to give a quick overview of the node tree and kind of show how I constructed it, and maybe it'll be interesting to some people or helpful. And if you have any other questions, please let me know in the comments. Okay, so here we are in Houdini. I'm going to just walk you through the SOP setup briefly, and then we'll move on to the Copernicus setup. I think this is a pretty nice setup. It could be optimized, but I wanted to give you a few tips that I did to implement this. If there's anything that needs clarification, please let me know in the comments. This whole setup is essentially based upon a curve. So you draw a curve and it'll make a brick wall with this top slate stones on top of it. And we can go in here and modify this curve. So if I go ahead and like drag this corner point, for example, we could bring this in and the wall will dynamically rebuild, and we will have the stones regenerated. So you can do whatever shape you want, and you'll have a nice wall. And so let me undo that. The other aspect of it is you can also project this curve onto a terrain. So right now we're just bringing in this kind of lumpy plane, and I can ray the curve onto that terrain, and we will have the wall, if I go to the preview, follow that terrain. So if I go back up to this terrain floor node where we're generating it, and I just have a mountain node here that's adding some variation. If I were to increase the amplitude on that, you can see that the wall is following that. So let's crank it up a bit. You can see we get this. Some things that I might need to look at, like if you were building this on a really lumpy terrain, the way I'm generating the slate, I have that bending. I think it's slate anyway. You really wouldn't want to have that bend. Those would be straight rocks, but you get the idea here. So we can stick the wall to any type of terrain we want. So I'll bring the amplitude of that back down a bit. And then let's jump back into our wall. And so we can put really any curve input in here. So if I have this switch node, I can switch it out to that spiral that you saw in the intro. And we get a spiral here. I could go into this spiral node and adjust the amount of loops. And it'll regenerate the wall. And there we have a giant spiraled brick wall. And I'll switch to regular quality lighting. So how does this work? Well, we have that in curve, which it's just a curve. It could be any curve. And it's really just built upon the sweep operation. And so the only special thing I'm doing here in the sweep node, so we have the in curve going into the sweep, is instead of using just a square or the pre-built square tube or things like that, I'm constructing the cross-section myself here, which is just these two lines. And so these two lines get fed into the sweep node, and the only reason I'm doing it like this is because it gave me a little bit more control over the UVs and UV scaling, so I could have those rows of bricks stacked exactly how I wanted to. I just didn't have as many options with the pre-built sweep geometry here under surface type. And so I can always go into one of these lines and move it a bit to thicken up this wall. And all of that is good. And so after that, really, it's pretty simple. It's just a sweep, a curve with a sweep, and Copernicus handles all the rock detail for the actual stones of the wall. The thing that's a little bit more complicated is the actual top bricks. And so the way that is handled is a little different. I tried a couple different ways for this. I'm just going to hide other objects and switch to my regular curve here. The way I handled the construction of this is my first thought was to just copy to points and have some different slate variations and copy it on the wall. But then you could run into issues where the wall curves and stuff where it might leave gaps, which might happen naturally, but I didn't want to have to deal with that. So my solution here, which I'm sure there's a more elegant solution, but this works for this case, is I take the same curve and I sweep it with a line, so you can see it right here, and I'll ghost the other part of the wall. So we're just sweeping the curve top here, and we extrude that and cut it up. So what I do is make a bunch of cutting planes here, and this is quickly, I don't want to make this a SOP tutorial or anything, but just to give you the theory here, at each regular resampled point of the curve, I take a bunch of planes, cut it up, and run a Boolean on this plane. And so I just end up with this fractured plane, which I extrude, remesh, do some other operations to, and I get something like this. So we get just our building blocks on top of it. And so there's a lot of nodes in here I'm glossing over, but really all of this is just to add some variation to the extrusions, just so all of these aren't exactly the same and extruded in the exact same way. So I'm building variation instead of using variance and different slate pieces. I'm building that variation in with the extrusion. And there's lots of ways to do anything in Houdini, and I think that's where people get bogged down sometimes. Really don't get too, in my view, like using Houdini for a bit now, I wouldn't get too bogged down in absolutely doing it the right way, because there's always going to be dozens, if not hundreds of ways of setting up everything. Now, if you want to be like a technical artist, you probably want to explore efficiencies and make sure things aren't going to be too cumbersome. But for this setup, there's pros and cons to it, but it was working well. The other little thing here to point out is I'm adding a little edge variation to the slate. I love the lab's edge variation node, but sometimes it doesn't quite work for me, depending on the size of the geometry. Someone could let me know if they have issues with that or if I'm doing something wrong. But another way of going about that is to do this setup where you just run a little bit of variation with a mountain node and then run another variation with a smooth node, and you just Boolean those together. Under the hood, I think for the polygonal edge detailed node, it might be doing that. And I'm talking about edge damage. So I'm talking about this node right here, this edge damage node. Sometimes this like blows up my geometry. Let's give it a shot here just to see what happens. Dun, 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 dun. So yeah, sometimes I get some unpredictable results, and I could probably fiddle with some of these settings and get it working. But for a quick one, this Boolean method works pretty well, and it gives you some variation to your edges. You can see like stuff like this, and if we just run some, we still have some kind of weirdness to it and some problem areas. But if we're at a viewing distance of like about here, that's just fine. And that's really what this wall is built for. It's not for like extreme close-ups where I might want to get more persnickety with some of the forms of these slates, and maybe even just build out the actual geometry to the rock wall and not use Copernicus. This is kind of like a medium distance / far distant wall. So it'll start falling apart a little bit if you go right up close to it. You'll start seeing some of the little Boolean errors. So a bit of an intricacy going on this side of the graph. All of this is just dedicated to building the slate on top, but really the wall itself is just a line with the sweep node. And I have this other little line to just close up this top area that's not textured or anything, just so you can't view inside the wall in accident if there's a little gap between the slate. So yeah, that's the wall. So let's go ahead and look at the Copernicus setup here. All right, let's go ahead and switch into our Solaris. Have a floating tree, speed tree up there just for some kind of gobo shadows. But here's the wall. And so all of this brickwork is just built with the new Copernicus network. Very fun to play with. Heavily inspired / using some of the techniques shown in the 9-Between series on the Houdini YouTube, which I can link below. And so in the final renders, I have some atmosphere and some other stuff just to make it look a little bit nicer. But here is the wall. And so the way this is working is, if we dive into the COPnet, I'm not going to go over this in depth because it is very similar to the tutorial I'm linking, but just a couple of things that I did differently that I think are worth pointing out. One kind of handy tip is when you're using the UV transform node here, to get the depth of the brick, you can always isolate the U and the V height separately in separate ramps and then combine those together. And then you can add that grout back in. And what this allows you to do is, when I was looking at my reference pictures, actually, let me bring up those right now. You can see that these bricks, they kind of have more of a slope kind of bevel to them into the crack on the U axis or the X axis, depending on how you want to view this. And then on the Y, it's a very sharp kind of tapering off. So I wanted to be able to isolate both the U and the V direction independently from each other. So you can do that instead of having this whole thing beveled the same distance like you might have with a regular brick wall. You can always tear that off, and then that lets you build in these slopes separately. So I could add more of a taper to the top here, and then you would have more of maybe square brick. And we can just jump back up and take a render and just see what that did, which is really the beauty of Copernicus. So now we have these sort of triangular shaped stones here. Much different feel to it, and kind of doesn't match my reference and ruins a little bit of how the grouting was working, but it does allow you that feedback. So if I jump back into the COPnet, we can pin this render and then bring this back, and you can see the effect that is having And if you're dealing with displacement, sometimes you just have to go ahead and click Restart Render here. And I'm going to click this little light button to get those lights away. So now you can see on the top we have more of a sharp bevel, and then on the bottom we have this broader bevel, because right here on our ramp, it's a very elongated ramp here. All right, so we have that bevel, which lets you control the sides and the top and the bottom independently. And then we bring it all the way over here. Same sort of ideas here with the Copernicus. We're layering different variations and noises here in our brick pattern to be able to get this to have, rock-like qualities. And that's really the name of the game with all procedural-based creation, is to layer these so it's not looking like you just threw one noise on top and called it a day. You really need to have some smaller noises, medium-sized noises, to get that level of detail to your textures. And so this all worked quite well to get this brick pattern. I'm very excited to see where they take this, and even I really hope be able to use this just as a compositing network in general, and then you can kind of, not have to buy the Nuke Indie edition anymore. Is my secret hope. And then the one other thing I wanted to mention is that for these slate pieces on top, you can definitely mix together the COP networks and more procedural texturing workflows. So with these, let me actually change the lighting just a bit so we can see a little better. So for these slate pieces, all of this variation and everything built into the slate, and I actually have some pre-renders I can just show right here. So all of this texture, these little lines, all of that sort of thing is just built using procedural nodes in the MaterialX context. And you can see here at this distance, this displacement will start breaking down a little bit. And if you really had to have a close-up of this, you would want to build up these stones just with regular geometry. You can see, even I keep going to the internet, I have these locally. You can see you have like soil and stuff in these cracks. If you really needed to see the top of these stones at a close-up, you might want to consider building out a section of this with actual geometry. But even at this distance, it holds up, pretty convincingly, in my opinion. And here we have the different spiral renders. But you can see here, all of this little noisy kind of river rock looking texturing isn't done with COPs. It's done with procedural, but you can mix them together, which is a pretty cool area to explore. So if I jump into the material for that slate, as I labeled it, I'm not even sure if that is slate, but that's what I've been calling it. If I jump into this network, you can see I'm not going to walk through this. If you're more interested in procedural networking, check out the Mylk video. But all of this is built with procedural noises layered upon each other. But what you can do within just a regular material context is you can always lay down a texture in here. So you can do a USD texture, or you can go and do a MaterialX texture here. So you can do a MaterialX image. And under the file name, you can use the same syntax that you're bringing in the COP network to. I'm just assuming that some knowledge is known. This is just more of like a show and tell rather than a complete tutorial or anything. But the same syntax we use on these quick materials to access the material textures in the COP net. So we got this op syntax, which isn't new. You could do this with the old COP network. But you can take that same syntax, which is essentially if you go into a COP network and select one of your output nulls and press Control C just to copy it, you can then jump into your material here and onto one of these images and Control V to paste the path. And then all you really need to do is do the op syntax here. Okay, I was having some technical difficulties there, so just cut out a bunch of stuff. But long story short, one cool thing about the COPs is you can mix it with the procedural material techniques within MaterialX. So if I take a MaterialX image node here, MaterialX image, and I use the op syntax, I can bring in a COP node just like before into the material network. So right now it's displaying the bricks because I had just done this and I'm just remaking it. Jump into the COP network, select the base color, press Control C to copy, jump back into my material network, press Control V in file name, and I just need to add OP colon to bring that in, since this is a internal reference, not an actual external file. And so now the viewport's been a little, sometimes it was updating when I did this, sometimes it wasn't, but you can see the remnants. If I plug this into the base color here, we will get those bricks showing through on the slate. So let me start up a XPU render here. And there we go. So we have the actual brick pattern there on the slate, and you could always mix this. If I put like a multiply here as an example, if I mix that with the procedural base color, we would have a combination of the two. You could use like a mixed node or combine it with whatever mathematical operations you want. So that's I think going to be a powerful workflow, is building some kind of substance designer like COP textures within the Copernicus network, and then combining that with procedural textures on top of that. I'm definitely going to explore that more. But really, it was just a fun experiment here making this wall. I'm definitely going to play around with COPs more. I think that's a big game changer for me, at least in terms of workflow and what software packages in general I'll need to be purchasing. So awesome addition by Side Effects, and just a show and tell, really. So hope you enjoyed this. I know it wasn't necessarily similar to any of my other videos, but wanted to get one in since I haven't posted in a while. Just been busy with moving and everything. So if you enjoyed this, let me know. If you want to see more deep dives on any specific thing in this video, please let me know. If you hated it, let me know. Doesn't really matter, but thanks for watching and have a great day. Bye-bye.